Welcome everyone, thanks for coming. Today we will have Professor James Robinson. He is professor at the University of Chicago. Also, as all of you probably know, he's Nobel laureate for 2024, along with his co-authors. Today he will be presenting his recent work on the culture, local context, and development, and reflecting kind of on the economics, the development economics field. His recent work, and not to take too much time on the introduction, I will leave it up and give the floor to Professor Robinson.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, thanks, and thank you for... Okay, so you have the access to the paper, the survey paper we're writing, so let me just kind of plunge straight into it. You know, the motivation, a lot of it kind of, if you thought about this in an East Asian context, a lot of the motivation for this paper or for kind of developing the ideas in this framework or the framework itself is to try to convince development economists that there's many things we understand much less well than we thought we did or we thought we do. Development economics, the way I was taught development economics, is very clear. There's some societies that are developed and there's others that are underdeveloped. And the way to become developed, if you're in a poor country, is to kind of mimic what rich countries do, basically. And that's how it goes, And I think, if you look at the study of development, what's happened in the last couple of decades is, first of all, there's all of these success stories that seem to come from doing something very different than mimicking what rich countries do. Okay, and I guess this became clear mostly in this discussion of the East Asian miracle and the role of the state in economic development. So how did Britain or the United States develop? Well, free markets, laissez-faire, minimal government intervention, etc. And then there's these other countries that become extremely successful using very different strategies, their own strategies. So I think that's part of where we're coming from here, not just asking, this is a point that goes back to the economic historian Alexander Gerschenkron in the 1960s. I might talk about that on Friday if I have time. Gerschenkron wrote this essay about economic backwardness, which I've always loved, which is about, there's very different ways. If you want to industrialize, there's different strategies for industrialization. And he compares Britain and Germany and Russia prior to the First World War. And he sort of says they all, and there's always, in the way the language he uses, there's always substitutes. Like you can do it one way, but one way may rest on particular institutions or history that only some societies have. But there's always substitutes. There's always different ways of doing it. So you could think about that. You could think about East Asian industrialization from that perspective of substitutes. But I think there's also a more profound challenge to development economics, which is sort of inspiring this paper. So I'm talking too much. So let me kind of plunge straight into kind of what's the building blocks of this paper. Well, we want to propose a taxonomy of what we call the determinants of development. So what do we mean by the determinants of development? We mean, the different characteristics of different societies that are associated with their poverty or their underdevelopment. So I'll start giving very concrete examples. I think that's the most useful thing. And I'm going to try to talk about in the paper, it's a survey paper, but today I'm going to start throwing in like real empirical papers so I can talk about some regressions and things like that, But so think about the determinants as the sort of the characteristics. So in a minute I'm going to quote Arthur Lewis. So when I was an undergraduate at the LSE, one of the first papers we had to read in economic development was Arthur Lewis's 1954 famous paper about, economic development with unlimited supplies of labor. So this is, Lewis kind of famously characterized the problem of development as being, there's a kind of modern sector of the economy and there's a traditional sector. And the problem of development is moving resources from the traditional sector into the modern sector. And he kind of says, what you have to do that is to accumulate capital, okay? That's what Marx said. That's what David Ricardo said. That's what Adam Smith said. I think Adam Smith called it stock rather than capital. Okay? So, and how do you accumulate capital? You have to get the saving rate up. Okay? So there, for him, poverty was a result of saving too little, basically. So that's an example of a determinant. And as economists, we can design policy interventions to try to increase the saving rate. Okay? So that's going to be an example of what we call a classical determinant. Okay? So kind of when economic development, as it used to be taught, would focus on some kind of key characteristics of poor countries and sort of say, this is the reason why they're poor, and that's what they have to change. Okay? So it might be about capital accumulation. It might be about health. Okay? Poor countries have lower life expectancy, higher rates of infant mortality, higher rates of maternal mortality. Their health is worse. Okay? So we need to do something about that. Or educational attainment is lower. Okay? Average years of schooling is lower. School enrollment is lower. Teachers don't show up to class, etc. Okay? Now, these are sort of like kind of, I would call these like bread and butter development issues. And what's sort of striking about them is there's a very clear welfare ranking here. Okay, now savings is a little bit more complicated. If you thought of saving as coming from some optimizing decision, you could say, well, but the fact that people are only saving 5% of their income, that's optimal. So, like, what's not to like? Like it's difficult to rank using welfare criteria saving rates. Okay, but these examples of health, for example, that seems very rankable. Okay, meaning good health is better than bad health. Okay, so we're going to talk about what I call classical determinants. So I'm motivating this discussion by talking about Arthur Lewis and health and education and geography, all sorts of things I'm going to come to. And we're also going to make a distinction between what we call vertical and horizontal determinants. Okay, and that distinction we think is sort of useful because vertical determinants is like health. That really goes back to, the way I was taught development economics, which is rich countries have better determinants than poor countries, And so that's a kind of vertical ranking. But I'm also going to kind of try to give examples and start talking about the fact that actually often it's very difficult to compare these determinants. And that's going to be a case we call horizontal. Okay? And I'm going to start arguing today, that's particularly difficult in the case of what I'm going to call non-classical determinants. Okay? So when I was taught development economics 40 years ago, it was all these classical determinants, and the way you thought about them is vertical. Like, we're in England, we're in London, we have better determinants than poor countries in Africa and Latin America. Okay? So they're classical determinants and they're ranked, vertically. But nowadays in development economics, we have a lot of what we're calling non-classical determinants, meaning people started investigating non-classical determinants of poverty or underdevelopment. Okay? So they started moving out of this world of health and education and capital or geography or, some of these things are harder to classify, like institutions. Like a lot of my work has been on institutions. So, Douglas North, for example, in his work emphasized a lot property rights and the security of property rights. Okay? So he would say North's book that had an enormous impact on me when I was a student, an undergraduate student, North and Thomas's book, The Rise of the Western World, he tells the story of the emergence of modern economic growth in Western Europe as a story of property rights became more secure. As property rights became more secure, investment incentives were better, capital started accumulating. So one idea of a kind of vertical classical difference would be we have secure property rights and poor countries have insecure property rights. That's what Douglas North used to think. Okay? It might not just be about the security of property rights. It could be about the form of property rights. So for example, I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. And most parts of rural Africa, land is not privately owned. Land is owned by kinship groups or descent groups. Okay. So land is owned collectively by families, basically by extended families. So there's a kind of collective ownership. So you might say, and there's a very famous paper by Harold Demsetz about this, that sort of tracks the emergence of private property from collectively owned property. So that would be a statement not really about differences in security of property rights, but it would be in the form of property rights. So a classical way of thinking about collectively owned property would be collectively owned property tends to be less efficiently utilized than privately owned property. And I'm going to give you a very clear example of that in a minute. Okay, so here's what comes in. Domestic institutions, giving you some sense of like how you think about ranking these and how they're connected to development. Okay, but non-classical, all sorts of stuff comes in there. So there's a huge amount of work now in behavioral development economics. So behavioral development economics is almost like a whole field, which is really about the merger of kind of psychology with development economics. Culture, which is what I told everybody I was going to talk about, that comes in here. I'm going to give you examples, customs, social norms, all sorts of things. So this is a very kind of heterogeneous bin where now it's like we kind of start thinking about different characteristics of society. For me, I remember one of the things that really got me thinking about this many years ago was the great book by Robert Putnam, called Making Democracy Work. So Putnam's book, which was published, I guess, early 1990s. So I just read it when it came out. My thesis advisor was raving about it. So I was in Australia teaching at the University of Melbourne. And I got this book and I read it. And Putnam's book is basically about why is it that the north of Italy, is much more prosperous and economically successful, in particular, much better governed than the south of Italy. And his explanation is in terms of like social capital, basically, that people in the north of Italy are much better at cooperating and they trust each other more. So it's like the nature of society is very different. And that's the reason why the government works better and why the north of Italy is more prosperous. And what's beautiful about the book also is just the measurement. So there's a huge amount of very creative measurement to show how, both to measure social capital and what he calls kind of associational life, the way that people interact with each other and cooperate and trust each other, but also how that spills over into politics. So that idea of like trust or social capital, that's a very weird thing for an economist to be thinking about, at least in 1993. But that would be a great example, I think, here of a kind of non-classical determinant. Now it would be very common to hear development economists talking about things like that, as differences in social capital or differences in trust as being a kind of interesting determinant. Now, that also sounds like it's kind of vertically ranked, though, no? Like, we have a lot of trust. If you look at these surveys like the World Value Survey, if you ask people in Africa, for example, do you think most people can be trusted? They say no. If you ask people in Sweden, I don't know what they say in Taiwan. Taiwan is probably super high, I guess. In China, it's very high. Mainland China, people say most people can be trusted. In Africa, that's like 10% of people say that. In the United States, it's probably, 60% or something. In China, it's 90%, but there's huge variation in how much you can trust other people. And the idea, that's a non-classical determinant of development. You can imagine how trust in society is important for all sorts of things. It's important for kind of writing contracts or making agreements, economic agreements, and so you can imagine that trust is very important in economic relations. It's important in capital accumulation, starting a business, getting a loan, and it looks like that's an example of a kind of non-classical determinant that, again, it's sort of vertical, like more trust is better than less trust, maybe, I don't know, And in fact, one of the things I'm going to try to argue, we argue in the paper, is that, this transition, like, in some sense, in this classical world, it's much easier to kind of rank these determinants and to say some determinants are better than others. As you move into this non-classical world, that gets much more complicated, and it gets much less ethically clear who has better determinants than other people. But I'm going to show you some data which we've created with ChatGPT. That sounds like ChatGPT made it up, which is not exactly what I wanted to imply. We have data, which we scraped a lot of articles, economics articles, and we used ChatGPT to classify different papers into, is it a paper in development economics? Is it about classical determinants or non-classical determinants? Does the author think of these things as being ranked vertically or horizontally? And one of the points of the paper is, if you're talking like Jeffrey Sachs, one of the things that kind of motivated some of the early work that Professor Asamoglu and I did, was, Jeffrey Sachs, because we thought Jeffrey Sachs was just so completely confused about more or less everything that somebody had to put him out of his misery. And it was our job to do it. And nowadays he's confused about Putin mostly, I'm not going to talk about that. In those days, he was confused about geography. And he had this argument that, geography was a fundamental determinant of development. I'm going to show you some regressions not by him. I couldn't bring myself to do it. And then there's a clear ranking too. Like countries in the tropics are poorer than countries in temperate latitudes. And it's better to be in temperate latitudes than it is to be in the tropics. Okay? So that's, again, I'd say that's a kind of, that's a classical, Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws in the middle of the 18th century already kind of had that empirical fact. Like Montesquieu already got that fact. Kind of interesting. In the middle of the 18th century, I guess Western Europeans were becoming self-aware that all these things were happening and all these changes were happening and they weren't happening in other parts of the world. And so Montesquieu kind of notes that how climate is responsible for civilization. But geography also has another property that I haven't really talked about yet so far that's also part of this taxonomy, which is whether these determinants can be manipulated or not. Okay? So I think that's much harder to think about than any economist pretends anyway. Like even my first example of the saving rate. It's one thing to say the saving rate's too low. You need to save more and have more capital accumulation. So that was a very big idea in development economics in the 1950s and 1960s. But how do you get people to save more? Well, Stalin in Russia knew how to do that. He just stopped them spending. All right? You just repress consumption. And you repress consumption, through the power of the state, the repressive power of the state. And that's how you accumulate capital. No, that's how the Soviet Union accumulated capital starting in the 1920s with the first 5-year plan. But if you don't want to coerce people into saving, how do you get them to save more? Well, as an economist, you say you could give them incentives. You can incentivize them. So I'm going to give you an example of that. But I think just to say that that's an example of something it seems at least potentially manipulable. Okay, poor health is manipulable. Geography is not manipulable. Okay, so I think this distinction, so the distinctions in the paper are really like classical determinants of development, non-classical, vertical or horizontal. Can you rank them vertically or not? And are they manipulable? Okay, and then there's going to be one final thing, which I'm not going to talk too much about today, which I guess is the really original bit of this paper. I mean, this is all original, but it's not very earth-shattering, which is, could we be in a situation which we call reverse vertical? Okay, what do I mean by reverse vertical? So let me give you an example from one of my friends at Stanford, Ian Morris. So Ian is a classical historian and I guess archaeologist. He was originally an archaeologist. And Ian has a book he worked on ancient Greece, like most of his work is on ancient Greece. He has this wonderful book called Burial in Ancient Society, which is about the invention of the graveyard. So you probably had never thought about this as being a kind of tectonic moment in human society. But it used to be the case in Greece that you'd bury people like under your house, kind of in the basement or in the garden or whatever. And then he noted archaeologically in Greek history, there's this moment where someone invents a graveyard, and then everyone buries their dead in the graveyard. And this is actually associated with significant political and social change, you know. So I won't elaborate more on that, but it's a beautiful book. Anyway, so he wrote a book called Why the West is Ahead for Now, which is basically about how China has better determinants than the Western world. Okay, so that's what, I haven't got it on this slide, but we're going to get to what I'm going to call reverse vertical. So why would China be poorer than the United States but have better determinants? Well, in his argument, China is only poorer than the Western countries or the United States because of a couple of hundred bad years. You know, the 18th century, the Qing made the mistake of like freezing the land tax in nominal terms. There was a lot of corruption. Stuff happened, you know. Europeans got lucky. They discovered the Americas that had this very synergetic effect on European economies, and there was the Opium Wars and whatever. There was all this stuff happens, you know. But stuff gets sorted out, you know. And now China has sorted out all that noise and whatever, and it's going back to the pre-existing equilibria, where for 1,000 years before the middle of the 18th century, China actually had higher levels of income per capita than the Western world. Why would it have higher levels of income per capita? Well, it's huge. It's huge scale economies. It has this very effective, centralized state, and it has kind of order. And you know, his argument is that's actually much better for economic development, ultimately, than this Western system. So the Western system just got ahead, but that was just sheer luck. That's Ian's argument. So I'm not going to defend or criticize that. I'm just saying, I'm just advancing it as an argument for what I'm going to call reverse vertical. It's a reverse vertical. It's a very provocative argument, and it's interesting. And we can talk about some others. Okay, so here's the matrix. We call this the classical matrix, which is just taxonomizing vertical, horizontal, manipulable, non-manipulable. So let me just talk about some of these examples. And I thought I'd start like with some empirical paper. You know, I call this the classical matrix. So let me just start with kind of low-hanging fruit, you know, by you know, two of my colleagues, one of my ex-colleagues, very famous paper on worms. So Michael, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in development economics, you know, his sort of flagship paper in 2004 was a randomized controlled trial of like deworming medicine, basically. So people in Africa, in Kenya, suffer from all sorts of parasites and intestinal worms. You know, I experienced this myself once, where I managed to pick up these intestinal worms in Nigeria, which turned out to be antibiotic resistant or whatever. The doctors got very exciting. I almost got my name on some medical papers because this one guy got so excited. He said, "Oh my gosh, we need to do a biopsy of your little intestine straight away. This is the most exciting thing I've seen for months." In the meantime, I'd lost 20 pounds of weight. So here's some descriptive statistics. These are school children in Kenya, different sorts of worms, hookworm, roundworm, etc. And, you know, 77, so this is just from kind of testing for the presence of these worms, just to give you some sense of how important these things are. This is 77% have some kind of hookworm infection, or 42% have some kind of roundworm infection. So these are intestinal worms, and the point is, these worms don't kill you, but they have all sorts of bad effects on you, in particular on school education, on attendance, on attention, on the achievement at school. Okay, so I'm not going to, there's all sorts of more details here that I don't want to go into. But what Michael did was Michael and Ted cooperated with the World Bank to do a randomized controlled trial. Okay, so this looks like a bad thing. Okay, this is bad. We'd like to get rid of worms. Okay, clearly vertical. Okay, there's an intervention. Okay, the intervention is there's medicines that can solve these problems. The Kenyans don't have access to them, where they're too poor or they don't understand. So the World Bank basically comes. You do a randomized controlled trial. You choose some schools randomly. You give these deworming medicine to the children, and then the paper just estimates, first of all, the impact of that on the presence of worms. Okay, so this is one of those ones where you might say, what's the ethics of doing this? Like, I'm going to give you, I know that you all have these parasites, but I'm going to randomly choose half of you and solve the problem, and the rest of you, like, forget it. Okay. So that's not very ethical. So the way these things work is, okay, we can roll it out. We roll it out. We choose half people randomly. We give them the medicine. The ones we haven't given it to them, yet are the kind of control group, but then everyone gets it. So there's a kind of staggering of treatment. So that's the kind of ethical solution to this. So, this is just like looking at, so think of group 1 is the treatment group. Group 1 is the group that gets these medicines. You can see, compared to the control group, that there's a very significant fall in the incidence of hookworm and roundworm. Okay, this is just to show that giving the medicine works. Okay, but what's the effect of this? Of course, this is great for welfare. Like this is great for people's health and what's not to like. But we're development economists, so we're in the world of development. So then you go on and look at the impact on school participation. Okay, so this is just basically looking at the difference between the treatment and control group. There's the difference between treatment and control. There's a positive effect on school participation. So when you give children this deworming medicine, it really increases their participation at school because they're ill, they're ill, they don't get ill so much, they have more energy, etc. So this is an impact on education. Okay, so health and education. So I think this is a very clear example of a kind of vertical rank. One thing here, again, I haven't said it yet, but when I talk about determinants, determinant is not something kind of exogenous. When I talk about latitude or being in the tropics, that sounds kind of exogenous, at least in some ordinary language sense. But of course, here, health and education, it's all endogenous. So a determinant doesn't have to be something which is exogenous in either the econometric or the ordinary language sense. Okay, so I think this is just a kind of classic paper on health and development. Okay, the paper is to sort of say, this is great, but it turns out that most things we're interested in development economics are actually not like this. But the development economists tend to take the intuition that they develop with studies like this and apply it everywhere. Okay, and I'll have some data on that. Okay, so we can give lots of other examples, let me say, of what I'm calling vertical and manipulable. But I've already talked about that. Like corruption could be a great example. All right? Corruption sounds like a bad thing, although there's famous papers that argue that corruption could be good. But I think generally speaking, most of the evidence is corruption is actually bad. Developed countries have less corruption, according to, what's it called? The NGO that collects all the anti-corruption data. What's it called? I can't remember. Anyway, most measures of corruption are far higher in poor countries than in developed countries. So you could sort of say, corruption is bad for development. Corruption, is clearly kind of vertically ranked, etc. So just like talking about different examples here. Okay, I talked about that. And so let me just go through some of these other cases without spending so much time on them. Like, what's an example, if I go back to the matrix, what's an example of, horizontal but non-manipulable? Well, geographical factor endowment. So, in the theory of international trade, we learn that, countries have different factor endowments. Like some parts of the world, like, California. California has the ecology to grow wine. Wine can only be grown in very specific parts of the world. Cocoa can only be grown in very specific parts of the world. Cocoa only really grows in like West Africa, parts of Latin America, and it's a very specific ecology. So if you're in Ghana in West Africa, then you can specialize in growing cocoa, and you can export cocoa and import something else. Okay, so in the theory of international trade, there's no real result. There's no theorem which sort of says, it's better to have this type of factor endowment than another. You could think of stories, there's some externalities or whatever. You can think of different stories. But in the basic model of, how kind of geographical factor endowments influence trade, there's no sort of clear ranking. We specialize and we trade, and that makes everybody better off. Okay, that's the famous result. So there's an example of horizontal and non-manipulable. Okay, what about vertical and non-manipulable? Well, you could say now we're back in the Jeffrey Sachs world, but as I said, I couldn't bear to show you a regression by Jeffrey Sachs, so I'm going to show you a regression from a paper by Enrique Spalaore and Romain Vaxiard called How Deep Are the Roots of Economic Development, which was one of these futile attempts to kind of regurgitate Jeffrey Sachs's agenda, which the economics profession seems to love for reasons that have always remained mysterious to me. But anyway, they run a regression of income per capita as a dependent variable, and on the exploratory variable they include things like latitude, okay, or whether you're a landlocked country. Okay, so this is the whole world. This is the dependent variable is income per capita at the level of a country, and what you see here is the latitude of the centroid of the country is positively correlated with income per capita. So as Montesquieu realized in the middle of the 18th century, systematically it's true that countries further from the equator or outside the tropics are richer than countries in the tropics. Okay, so that's an example of a vertical, non-manipulable way of thinking about development, okay, the determinants of development. So I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I think it's all nonsense. Correlation does not establish causation. And I'm not going to talk about my work on this. All right. So what about horizontal manipulable? A lot of the work that we did early on was to show that this is an example of omitted variable. This is an example of omitted variable bias. That the main reason that tropical countries are poorer is because they have worse institutions. And the reason they have worse institutions is because of European colonialism. So there's actually no real causal effect of geography on income per capita. It just looks like there is if you don't control properly for institutions. So, okay, I couldn't stop myself talking about it anyway. All right, so what's an example of horizontal but manipulable? Okay, so a horizontal difference that you can't manipulate. So one nice example I thought of, is kind of, let's say, the location of cities. So location of cities, perhaps, cities might be important for economic development, but it's not clear that where they are matters. Or infrastructure might be important, but it's not clear where it is matters. There's a beautiful paper by Hoyt Bleakley and Jeffrey Lynn, which is really about the indeterminacy of, the location of urban areas. And how do I know that? Well, they look at, if you look at the eastern United States, there's a whole bunch of cities, Columbia, Augusta, Macon, Columbus, Montgomery. And you could look at that and ask yourself, why are those cities where they are? Did some geographer or economist solve some complicated linear programming problem and decide that the optimal place to have a city was here? And it turns out the answer to that is no. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just, if I went back in history, this is where the river basically couldn't be navigated. So the coastal rivers can't be navigated above that fault line. This is where there were all these faults and falls were. So you had to stop the boat and you had to carry the stuff, okay? Porterage. So what happens when you have to stop the boat? You have to take the stuff out of the boat. You have to carry it up and put it, well, people have to be there. You need porters. Someone builds a house. A city starts. An urban settlement starts. And it turns out, hundreds of years later, when no one cares and no one does any porterage and we have motorways and railways and stuff, nevertheless, all those cities are in exactly the same place. Okay, Minneapolis is a great example, also the big city of Minneapolis. So Minneapolis is at the furthest reach of navigation up the Mississippi River. Moscow, I think, if I understand correctly, Moscow in Russia is where it is because of threatened invasion, by Mongols and people from the steppes, which I don't think is a big problem anymore in Russia, but nevertheless the city stays in the same place. So this is just to say, it turns out there's a lot of indeterminacy in the location of cities in the world. There's kind of some historical reason why people might have agglomerated in one place, but once that agglomeration starts, it's really unusual for it to move somewhere else, okay? And here, the reason for those, there was a kind of determinant of where those cities were historically, but it's completely irrelevant today. Totally and utterly irrelevant for anything, but nevertheless, people are in the same place. Okay? So this is just to say, we may think cities are a good thing, but their location is just, irrelevant. And this is just these very cool, it's just showing where the population is around this, what he calls the fall line. It's a beautiful piece of research, this paper. I love this paper. Okay, so there's the classical matrix, and I started talking about horizontal, vertical, and manipulable, non-manipulable. But the next thing we kind of point out is, when you start getting into these cases, and I started raising this issue with Lewis's paper, you have to start asking, how do I actually increase the saving rate? Like if I give you deworming medicine, beautiful, that looks like really straightforward. I kind of know what lever to pull. But what lever do I pull to increase the saving rate? And, for me, I guess one of the biggest things about my whole kind of career has just been, I was taught economics as like a really kind of hardcore economist. My thesis advisor was a mathematical economist called Truman Bewley. So I was taught general equilibrium theory, and I was preparing myself for a career teaching general equilibrium theory and all this mathematical economics. And then at some point, I kind of had a Damascus-like moment, if you know the Bible, and realized this was a kind of ludicrous way of thinking about the world. So that actually, you can't disentangle economics from politics, from society, from history, from culture, from, that it's all part of this sort of system. Now, that system, of course, is really, really difficult to study, which is an argument for keeping things simple and pretending that there's something called economics that you can study without studying everything else. But a lot of my career has been sort of trying to gradually kind of unpack all of that, okay? So, but I think like what we tried to show in the next section is, even when you start thinking about these classical kind of differences and you start thinking about interventions, it's difficult to get away from these interactions with the rest of society, okay? And we give a bunch of examples of that. And so let me just talk about a couple of these examples. And I think in some sense, like we thought about this as a transition to the non-classical matrix, So the classical matrix is supposed to be, okay, here's what every development economist kind of understands and how we think. And then you start pointing out, it's a little bit more complicated than you thought it was, or it's a little bit more. And so you could say, oh, the non-classical matrix, great, we're interested in all these things like social capital, and, you could just plunge into that. But the idea here is to sort of say, well, actually, even before Putnam wrote his book, this non-classical stuff comes up kind of en passant because the economy isn't really hermetically sealed from the rest of society. And if you look at these studies, weird things happen all the time. And that's really the kind of non-classical stuff too. So it was a different way of like motivating the non-classical thing. So let me just give you a couple of examples which I find very fun. One of which, is one of my favorite pieces of research in social science by James Ferguson. So James, who passed away recently, was a very brilliant social anthropologist at Stanford. And he wrote his dissertation in Lesotho in southern Africa. Okay, the book is called The Anti-Politics Machine, which is a kind of weird title, but it's really about how it's a kind of critique of development aid as being this apolitical kind of technocratic exercise. Okay, you'll see why he concluded that. But he doesn't talk about it like this. But for the purposes of this lecture, let me talk about it in the following way. He's interested in, let's say, why Lesotho is a poor country. So Lesotho, is a landlocked country in southern Africa, kind of surrounded by South Africa, mountainous, mostly rangeland, land is owned collectively by kinship groups and families, which is typical in Africa, as I was saying, although some land is owned by bigger communities and governed by chiefs. Okay? Now, if you're an economist and I told you, land is owned collectively, what paper would you have in mind about the efficiency of the allocation of rights to use that land? Garrett Hardin. Okay, so in Lesotho, the land is collectively owned in different ways by families, etc., by communities. There's overgrazing. Okay, there's a lot of cows. It's mostly range land. They're not farming. There's overgrazing. There's overgrazing. What would you do if you were, if you were an economist? You'd think, great, tragedy of the commons. Okay, so the tragedy of the commons comes because it's a communal resource. I have my cows. I put my cows on the commons. The cows eat the grass. So that's good, but it imposes a negative externality on you. Okay, your cows come. I don't take into account. I take as given in a Nash equilibrium the number of cows you put on the commons, and the equilibrium involves too many cows because we don't take into account the negative externalities we impose on other people when we put our cows on the commons. Okay, so this is how the tragedy of the commons works. I think his original example is actually lake in a fish. When I take out a fish, I make it more difficult for you to find fish, so there's too much fishing in equilibrium. Okay, so the World Bank, according to Ferguson, comes, Lesotho's poor, they have this model in their head, tragedy of the commons. Great. Okay, we have to solve that problem. Okay, and they characterize the institutions of Lesotho as like backward, let's say. In Lewis's paper, Arthur Lewis's paper, there's the traditional, he calls it the traditional sector. Okay, so traditional, backward, So the traditional sector has things like collective property rights. Modern developed countries don't have things like that. Okay, so you have to solve the problem. How do you solve that problem? Well, that's a tricky thing. Like, you've got too many cows. Like, you could privatize the commons, okay? So that would be a radical economic solution. But you can't really pull that off in Lesotho. Like that would, you have a revolution on your hands if you try to do that in Africa. So that policy solution is off the table. So what levers do you have? Well, what the World Bank tried to do was, okay, you could try to internalize the externality. So let's create stockholders associations. Okay, we create these associations of stockholders. We create incentives for these people to form these kind of cooperatives, and then they'll naturally internalize the externalities. Okay, that was one idea. The second thing is, it's a traditional sector. They probably don't have markets. We'll open some markets. So the World Bank decides to open markets so you can sell your cows. Probably you just can't sell your cow. If only you could have a market, you'd sell your cow. I'm making fun of the World Bank. It's low-hanging fruit. But so the tragedy of the commons, I'm talking about the policy levers. Okay. So what Ferguson points out, and what he calls the bovine mystique here, is, I could jump to what's the consequence of this policy. The consequence of the policy is like zero, essentially. Okay, let me just jump to the consequence of the policy, and I'll tell you why it didn't work. Okay, it didn't work, and this is where searching for fish in trees comes in. It didn't work in the sense that the World Bank created markets, nobody sold their cows. Okay, they created the stockholders association, nothing happened. Okay, at the level of the policy, nothing happened. Okay, but what Ferguson points out, and hence the title Anti-Politics Machine, is the very fact that the World Bank gave the government lots of money and it cooperated with the government to start these NGOs and build these markets actually pushed the government of Lesotho into these kind of peripheral areas where it had never been before. So it had the effect of expanding what was a fundamentally kind of non-legitimate government into these rural areas. Okay? So it had profound kind of political consequences that the World Bank didn't even think about, because they was an unintended consequence. But that's why he calls it the anti-politics machine. Like, it looks like a technocratic solution to an economic problem, but actually it has these profound political consequences. Okay? the project was a failure as an agricultural development project, it's indisputable that many of its side effects had a powerful and far-reaching impact on the region, okay? Giving the government of Lesotho a much stronger presence in the area than it has ever had before, okay? So why didn't it work? Okay, it didn't work because the World Bank had a totally incorrect model of what was going on, okay? Meaning they had this model of like the tragedy of the commons and whatever, okay? But that had nothing to do with what was going on with the cows. And the most interesting part of the book for me, you know, who studied Africa for so long, is he talks about what was going on with the cows. Okay, I could talk for hours about cows. You know, one of the countries I worked in, the first country I worked in Africa for a long time was Botswana. And Botswana, you know, they love cows in Botswana. So I gave these lectures at the University of Botswana. And then on Friday night in Gaborone, the capital, these guys took me out for dinner. And I was like, okay, so what do you do in Gaborone at the weekend for fun? Like, what do people do? And this guy told me, oh, I drive out to my cattle post in the bush. Like, I have all these cows, thousands of cows in the bush. So I get my four-wheel drive, and I drive out into the bush into my cattle post. And I said, like, what do you do in your cattle post? And he said, I listen to my cows breathe. That's Botswana. Okay, so cows are like incredibly important, like culturally and in many ways all over Eastern and Southern Africa. And most of Ferguson's book, you could read that. There's an article. He has an article, which is, there's the book, but there's also an article called The Bovine Mystique, if you're interested in it. It's like fascinating, trying to understand the cows and the commons, you have to understand the whole role of cattle in Basotho society, okay, and the cultural significance, and also the way the Lesotho economy was integrated into the global economy. And this was a period of apartheid in South Africa. So most of the men, it turned out, were not even in Lesotho. They were working in South Africa in the gold mines, okay? But in apartheid, they couldn't live, they were guest workers in some sense. And when they retired, they had to move back to Lesotho. Okay. Now, you're in Johannesburg, you have to retire in Lesotho. Okay. You need to save money for retiring. How do you save money? Well, you could put money in the bank. But that's no good. Why? Because your relatives can spend it. Particularly your wife can spend it. So that's no good. You don't want to put money, the money won't be there when you get back, okay? So you can instead use cows. Now, what's the difference between cows and money? You can't sell cows. You can buy cows, but basically you can't sell them, right? You can't sell a cow in a market. So the World Bank created a market for you to sell cows without understanding that in Basotho society, you basically never sell a cow. It's just like you don't sell a cow, okay, because they're so culturally significant. Now, here's the more interesting bit. You're in Johannesburg. You're going to retire in Lesotho, okay? You want to develop social relations. So, for me, like the most significant thing about Africa, African society, like the most important principle about African society is what they call wealth in people. There's wealth in people. Like when people think about wealth, they think about social connections. They don't think about stuff. They think about social connections. I was doing some work in Malawi last year with a friend of mine who's a linguist, who's a Malawian linguist. And we were in this village and with this lady, and this lady starts talking about like wealth. And I asked her, like, what do you mean by wealth? And she said, children. Children. If you have a lot of children, you're wealthy. So that's like wealth in people. If you have a lot of children, you're wealthy. Okay? So you need social connections. But how can you develop social connections when you're living in Johannesburg? Cows. Okay? Because cows, I have a cow, I can lend you my cow. Okay? And that is a substitute for a social relationship. So you build social relationships by lending your cows to people. Okay? So when you come back and you retire, now you have all these people you lent your cows to. That's like your people. Okay? So it's a surrogate for creating money. Cows. That's a whole different ballgame. Okay? One last piece of the puzzle. Okay? When you get married, the groom has to give bride wealth to the family of the bride. And you give bride wealth only in cows. Okay? Money is not acceptable, has to be in cows. Okay? And there's a very culturally specific way in which the cows are distributed. The cows go to the bride's father, the mother, the uncle, the relatives. You probably need 50 cows to get married. It's a lot of cows. You know, I've been working for many years in Congo. If you ask our Congolese collaborators, like young men who collect data who work with us, like what are you going to do with all this money we pay you? They'll say, like, get married. I'm saving up to get married. I don't have enough money to get married because I have to pay bride wealth. I just need the money to get married. So, but you have to do it in cows, not in Congo. Cows die in Congo. Too unhealthy for cows. But in Lesotho, you give cows. And you have to distribute the cows. Okay? So what Ferguson shows is that means there's lots of other people with an interest in this, you know, because the people who are going to get the cows in the bride wealth, they need the cows, you know. Like, there's no cows, they don't get the cows in the bride wealth. So he unpacks beautifully the kind of social norms and the traditional economy and the incentives and the interests that kind of surround this cattle-owning economy, okay? And I think the most important thing here is just to say, like, okay, the World Bank policy, you know, we can laugh at the World Bank, but the interesting bit is to kind of unpack the way in which this kind of economic problem was embedded in this much bigger cultural equilibrium. Okay, so I think let me talk about one more example and then I'll shut up. Okay, so it's one of my favorite pieces of research. So, you know, one thing I had to do when I got the Nobel Prize is they want you to write this biography, you know, which I found very intimidating to start with, you know. But after a bit, you kind of enjoy writing about yourself, you know. But one of the things I write, I think it should be on some web page somewhere, I write about is like books that changed my life, you know. Like for me, like reading a book can change your life, like, and it has done for me. Like you read a book and it just sets you off in Bob Putnam's book. I don't think I even mentioned that one. I mentioned Bob Bates's book, Markets and States in Tropical Africa. Like it just, you read a book and it just, the world is different, you know. So, and Ferguson's book is like that. Okay, so one more example of like how you have to think about these non-classical, you know, that I'm calling, that bovine mystique, I'm calling this like a non-classical, I don't know what the consequences of that for economic development are, but it's a very non-classical set of norms and practices. And okay, so I already mentioned Arthur Lewis. A lot of economists, you know, and I mentioned this problem of how you increase the saving rate. Well, a lot of economists have this idea that, you know, I'm not quite sure how to describe it. Maybe this is like a behavioral mechanism. Like people have self-control problems, you know, like you might want to save, but you know, you have these, in this article they call it like temptation goods, you know, like it's like being an alcoholic or something, you know. You realize that it would be good to be sober, but it's really difficult to stop yourself drinking, or like giving up smoking or something like that, you know. Some things are habit forming, and you recognize that it would be better if you didn't drink alcohol and you didn't smoke, but it's really hard to stop yourself, you know. So that's like a kind of self-control problem, you could say. So here, I already said this about Lewis, you know, like the third thing is, this is a quote from Lewis's paper, right? The real problem is, you know, how do you get a community which, sorry, typo, was previously saving and investing 4 to 5% of national income to start saving and investing 12 to 15%. Sounds straightforward, but how do you do it exactly? So one strategy that development economists, quite a few very well published papers on this have used is, okay, if you think about this as a self-control problem, we can do interventions to help you solve that problem. So what's an intervention? Well, I give you a box, a lockbox, which may or may not have a key. And when you get some money, you put the money in the box. Okay, if it doesn't have a key, you can't spend it. If it has a key, you can open the box, but somehow just the fact that it's in the box and there's a key and you have to open the box, I shouldn't be doing this really. Even that may have an effect on saving. That's the idea. Okay? So let me give you an example of a lockbox, as an intervention to try to help people save more. Okay? So it's a paper by Ricardo Godoy, Dean Carlin, very distinguished development economist at Northwestern, the gentleman who President Trump kicked out of his office at the USAID. He was the chief economist at USAID, who had to be escorted out of the building by police. Anyway, so this is what it's called. And they did this experiment in a kind of, I don't quite know what the right adjective is. They call it an autarkic society, but it's a people called the Shimane in eastern Bolivia. Okay, so this is more or less like a hunting and gathering group in the plains, what they call the Media Luna in Bolivia, in eastern Bolivia. So this is a kind of small-scale society, not integrated into kind of modern Bolivian society. You would have called it a hunter-gatherer group. Okay, and so they introduced these lockboxes to try to help people save more. They thought these are poor people. They don't have many assets. They're poor. We need them to save more. Okay, what do we do? All right, so we introduced a lockbox. Okay, so here the dependent variable is value of financial assets. Okay, so a treatment is just some people I randomly give these lockboxes to, and I explain to them, like if you get some money, you can put it in the lockbox. That's going to help you save, etc. So, and they could have, there's differences potentially between men and women, and you could have a lockbox, as I explained, with a key or without a key. Okay, so you randomly give people lockbox with a key or without a key. Okay, so what's the effect of that? Well, you can see what the effect is. It has a positive effect on your assets. Okay, so it works in the sense of improving your saving. What's the consequence of improving your saving? Well, it turned out the consequence of improving your saving was you spend much more on hard spirits and liquor. Okay, so what people did was they saved more money, then they had a kind of lump sum which they spent on a big party, and they bought liquor, and everyone got drunk. And the explanation for that is this is a society where status is incredibly important, like social status is incredibly important. And one way you establish status is by hosting people and having a party and distributing liquor. So by allowing people to accumulate, they had more resources to actually throw these parties, to buy liquor, and accumulate status. Okay. Now, of course, that's not, there's some results on like blood pressure. It's not really significant or whatever, but there's actually some evidence of, there's not much evidence on cigarettes or beer or chicha, which is like beer, like artisanal beer made from maize, because to have a real party, you need liquor. Okay. So, and there's some negative results on health. Of course, having binge drinking liquor is like not good for your health, last time I checked. Okay, so here's this is, I'm being a bit unfair to these economists maybe, but just to say, like, this is, they thought about this as there's a bunch of isolated individuals, they have a problem saving, we're going to help them save, but they didn't conceptualize the nature of this society, or how this kind of what looked like a simple economic decision was actually kind of embedded in this system of status and the accumulation of status. Okay, so let me shut up, and I'll make the transition on Friday to the kind of non-classical matrix, and I'll talk about some of the issues in the paper. That's the plan. Okay, so if you have a chance, have a look at the paper before Friday. And I tend to talk too much, but perhaps you'll have kind of warmed up a bit by Friday afternoon, and you can ask some questions. Okay, great. All right, see you Friday.